One.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session of the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. We have one item on our agenda today. It's the Spending Affordability Guidelines, or more affectionately known as SAG, for FY27 capital budget and the FY27 through 32 capital improvements program. Before I turn it over to council staff to walk us through the packet, and I welcome the staff from OMB and Finance up to the table if they'd like to join us. And I see we have the Director of Parks here as well today. I appreciate everyone coming, and before we start and I turn it over, I want to just level set, because there's been more conversation, I think, this year than others about our spending affordability guideline and what our job is today as Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. So we are charged with making a recommendation to the full council that must adopt these guidelines by resolution by the first Tuesday in October of each odd number calendar year. So that is before October 7th, 2025 this year. The spending affordability guidelines are set based on exactly what it says. What is affordable? What is our revenue based on the projections that we have at the moment? It is not based on need. We talk about need when we have our budget conversations, and we look at all the different need across the county. This is based on our affordability and what we know at this moment. We are also able to revisit this by the first Tuesday in February, according to our county code. So today is a check-in. This committee will review the recommendations and where we are and present that to the council for the resolution vote before October 7th, and then we are able to revisit it again in February. But I just kind of wanted to level set, because I think there's been more conversation about this year than in prior years. So with that, I will turn it over to the staff.
Good morning. Today we'll go through the CIP SAG process a little bit, as well as the assumptions, and we have OMB and Finance here that can help us out with that. And then also, as you mentioned, go through some of the options that staff has put together that include an executive recommendation as well as an alternative option to that, and also the working off of the approved as well. So some general considerations for the committee. As the chair mentioned, the focus is on affordability, not need. It's a very important consideration to keep in mind. We look at recent trends and future estimates on the macroeconomic side, and also there's more qualitative risks that the committee and the full council ultimately will have to take into account that aren't quite as quantifiable as some of the indicators that we have here. But we will go through some of the key assumptions and guiding metrics and the options. As you mentioned, in odd-numbered years, the council sets the spending affordability guidelines for the upcoming CIP. Specifically, you're setting years 1 and 2 of the CIP as well as the 6-year total. Although typically with the 4 out years, we tend to try to make those either level or some reasonable ramping up or down depending on the overall process. But the SAG guidelines themselves impact years 1 and 2 and the 6-year total. And then in February, as was mentioned, the council can review the SAG guidelines that it approved either the prior October or the year before that. And it can increase those years 1 and 2 by up to 10%. And there's no limitation on what it could increase the 6-year total by. So there's a little nuance there in terms of what the council can do, but it's a little more limited in February, obviously, than in an odd-numbered October, odd-numbered year for October. Just some background on where the county has been with its SAG guidelines. This goes back to the FY17 approved spending affordability. And you can see we were at quite a high level, $340 million over each year for 6 years. At that time, the metrics started to deteriorate a bit, and the council either unanimously or close to unanimously agreed to begin to ramp down the individual years, bring them down to get the metrics back up. And you can see that over the last 5 or 6 cycles, the council has done that. And the numbers currently went from 340 million per year. They're currently at 280 million per year. So that's important. But keep in mind that the bonds are basically in play for 20 years. That's our bond cycle. This doesn't represent the bonds that are issued. This represents the spending affordability, but the bonds are issued each year based on what the county needs in order to make to pay its bills. And those bonds do have that long tail to them, like I mentioned, which goes beyond the 6-year period that we're talking about today. So that's another important consideration. While we look at the metrics over the 6-year period, you also want to keep in mind where are you leaving things at the end of the 6-year period going forward. If you have additional debt than you otherwise would have based on an option, then that debt will carry over and affect the future metrics. I'll turn it over now to Naeem here to talk about some of the options that we've looked at and some of the metrics associated with those.
Okay, so good morning. This brings us to today's SAG discussion. Staff developed 3 options for the committee consideration. Option A is to maintain the current trajectory for GO bonds and park and planning bonds. So it would be $280 million a year for GO and $8 million a year for park and planning. This is council staff's preferred option, given where we are in the metrics, which we'll cover in a little bit. It is a conservative approach, but it is there. I'll jump to option C, the executive's recommendation, before going to B. For C, the executive is recommending an increase from 280 to 340 in year 1 of the CIP SAG, eventually wrapping up to $290 million by FY32. So his 6-year total is about $2.19 billion versus $1.68 billion option A. That's a $500 million of increased bond capacity. For park and planning bonds, the executive is recommending a 3% increase in each year from $8 million to $8.3 million, going from $48 million in the 6 years to $49.8. Finally, I'll talk about option B. This is a staff-developed option to look at a middle ground option that's essentially intended to be a modest increase to option A from the current trajectory. So for GO bonds, that would amount to a $20 million increase per year, about 7% for GO. And for park and planning bonds, it would be a $1 million increase per year to $9 million a year, or about 12.5%. And the park and planning option was developed in conversation with park and planning staff based on their input. Next slide, please. Okay, so underlying each of these options and the metrics for each option are a common set of assumptions that the Department of Finance prepares. The chart before you is essentially a comparison of the key assumptions from August of this year, last month, to where the data and the forecasts were in February of 2025, so 8 months ago, when the council last reviewed the SAG. It's a little hard to read, but I'll summarize in the next slide what the changes are. So of the 6 key variables, the annual interest rate compared to today's SAG analysis versus from February has been unchanged. It remains at 5%. That's assumed for all 6 years. The operating budget revenue growth for this year, for the current year FY26, has been revised sharply upwards, 7.3% year over year versus 2.8% was the previous forecast. In the future years, the 27 through 32 CIP SAG period, the forecasts have been revised slightly upward. So they remain, they're not anticipating the massive growth we saw in FY26, but they have been revised slightly upwards. Population forecasts remain unchanged from the previous SAG review. The inflation forecast has been revised slightly higher for the first 2 years of the CIP, 27 and 28, and slightly lower in later years. And then in 31, 32, they're assumed at 2.3%. The countywide assessable property tax base has been revised higher for 27 to 30 compared to the previous forecast. And it's about 4% higher in FY27 and 7% higher in FY30. And this again reflects the housing market, relatively hot housing market we've seen the last couple of years. And then finally, total personal income has been revised slightly higher in FY27 to 30, and that's a little bit higher than the previous forecast as well. And so these assumptions and inputs, they drive the debt capacity indicators for all 3 options. we have 5 total indicators that we look at. These are all quantitative metrics. The first indicator is total debt should not exceed 1.5% of the full market value of taxable real property in the county. The second indicator, which is I've highlighted in italics because there's a recommendation from the executive on adjusting that methodology, which we'll discuss in a bit. But essentially, it's the sum of debt service for bonds and long-term and short-term lease payments should not exceed 10% of the general fund operating budget revenue. So what we pay for debt service should not exceed 10% of any given operating budget in any given year. The real debt per capita amount for FY26 is $2,550. This is essentially the amount of debt we have over the population. And so since our population has not been growing a lot, the per capita debt has been going up a little bit in the trends, as you'll see in a little bit. The ratio of debt to total personal income should not exceed 3.5%. And finally, the last metric, which is a little bit funky, I would say, is that 60 to 70% of the debt at the beginning of any period should be paid off in 10 years. I'm not sure why there's a 75% upper number, but it's there to just show sort of a healthy rate of repayment of debt. Next slide. And these are some of the other factors that are listed in the county code. Again, some of these are quantitative, some are qualitative. The county council should consider the growth and stability of the local economy and tax base, among other factors as well, the rate of repayment of debt principal, availability of state funds, size of the total debt outstanding at the end of each fiscal year. So beyond the 5 debt capacity indicators, we do have some other factors, and we've talked about them in the packet and as well as the presentation a little bit to kind of show these factors as they change. A lot of numbers here, but I'll highlight the sort of the key takeaways across the 3 options. So for all 3 options, the first indicator, GO debt to assessed value, has improved and remains under the guideline metric of 1.5%. So all 3 options are doing well on that front. Option A, of course, is doing a little bit better than option C, just given the amount of GO debt differences among the 2 options there. But you'll see, and we'll go a little bit more in charts in a little bit. But the debt service to revenue ratio, you'll see option A fails in the first year, but improves in the subsequent years. Option B technically fails in the first 3 years, but then improves in the last 3 years as well. And then option C remains above the 10% guideline for first 5 of the 6 years of the CIP period. Real debt per capita, again, all 3 options fail on that front. They're above the guideline metric, and again, that's reflecting our population growth essentially not changing compared to the last forecast. And then finally, the other 2 indicators, all 3 options do pass. They remain under the target metric. And again, here you'll see the change over years for each of the options. The first blue column is the forecast from the prior SAG review this past February. All 3 options have improved in the first 4 years compared to that forecast. Again, driven by changes in the housing market, property tax values. And then here we go to debt service as a percentage of operating budget revenues. Again, all 3 options have improved compared to the forecast last February, again being driven by increased operating budget revenue growth we've seen in the last couple of years. Real debt per capita, as I noted, all 3 options fail, but the amount here the trend is going in the opposite direction. They're actually worsening, again reflecting our outstanding debt when compared to our population growth, which is not being forecasted to grow, at least from the last SAG review. And then finally, the second to last ratio, here we all see all 3 options are meeting the guidelines. They've improved since the prior SAG review, and they are showing improvement over the 6-year period as well. Finally, our payout ratio, all 3 options have improved compared to the previous forecast. The higher numbers are actually, you could think of as being better since we're paying off more debt than the lower numbers. But again, option A is performing better than option C as we move forward in time. Finally, this is not a key debt capacity indicator, but it is. We did take a look at what the estimated debt service impact would be on the operating budget across 3 options as we move forward in time. The difference in FY27 is $1.5 million for option C. Option C, you'd be paying $1.5 million more than option A. But by FY2032, the delta increased to $31.5 million. So this shows how, over time, as we issue more GO bonds under option C, the debt service gets higher and higher. And we will take a look at beyond the 6-year period as well to see what that tail end looks like in time for the full council review. And then finally, on this chart, this is a comparison of the total outstanding debt, amount of GO debt we carry on the books, essentially. You'll see in FY27, between option A and C, the delta is $57 million, but by FY32, the gap of the amount of debt we carry is about $430 million over this, as it ramps up quite dramatically, even within the 6 years, and then that's a tail that will carry forward after the 6 years as well. And finally, I'll talk about the alternate methodology that the CE has referenced in his transmittal memo. He essentially looked at the debt service to revenues indicator, and it incorporated additional amounts of current revenue that we currently don't have in the original metric. So these are revenues like current revenue for fire services, current revenue for recreation, for mass transit. And so what that does is it increases the numbers across the options in a more favorable way, such you get to the point they're all under 10%. However, the outcome between A and C under the alternate metric, A is still seen as favorable slightly than C. Staff would not advocate for changing the metric at this time. I think there's discussions to be had for a future SAG review, but given that a lot of staff analysis is done to look at comparing this SAG review to the previous SAG review, we would not advocate for changing that metric or incorporating that at this time. But the results between option A and C don't change even with the new metric. Finally, that's it. Open for questions. Staff is, Ms. Silberman is here to talk about the methodology or anything else. So.
Great. I'll turn it over to the county exec staff. Ms. Silberman, do you want to kick us off, or?
Thank you, Rachel Silberman with the Office of Management and Budget. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for having us and stress that as you're seeing the debt affordability metrics look better than they have in 15 years, that's largely due to the updated projections as approved in the most recent operating budget fiscal plan, and the county executives recommended debt levels are affordable in our view, based on the metrics that you see before you. Even in kind of the peak year on that key debt service to revenues ratio, we remain within a 0.25 percentage point of that 10% level, and by the 6th year, we are under the level. As far as the alternative revenue metric, that is provided sort of as an additional piece of context to help you understand that the measure as it has been adopted is conservative relative to some of our other peers. Montgomery County is unique in the state. We're one of 3 jurisdictions that has a separate fire tax fund. So, fire service is a core county function that we effectively pay with our property tax, but we do shave it off into its own property tax segment, and so it does not come into that revenue metric as it does in other jurisdictions. So that is a comparative point for you to kind of understand where the executive branch is coming from on the recommendations.
Anything else? No? All right. Let's actually, since we ended there, maybe I'll kick off with my questions at that point. Mr. Mia, when is the last time we actually reviewed the indicators for SAG? I know, we've taken up our reserve policy recently, but has there been a review of the indicators we use?
Not in my time at council. I don't know if you have any. Probably quite a lot.
Would probably be a Dr. Orland question.
Yes.
All right.
I don't think, certainly not in the last 5 or 6 years.
So I appreciate the county exec's office raising this, but I think I agree with the council staff that changing how we calculate something midstream as we're doing the process, I don't think is a good policy. And so particularly as, I think it was slide 10 that looks at some of the other indicators that we need to consider. The top one there is on the second is the criteria used by rating agencies related to credit worthiness, including maintenance of our AAA bond rating. I think anyone who would look at us changing our definition as we're also saying this is what we're going to set our SAG at is probably not a good practice when we go before our rating agencies to talk about our financial policies. So I think we can maybe table that for another discussion if my colleagues agree with that. And at a point when we're not discussing what the SAG guidelines should be, that we then take a look at that. So I think that is one thing. And I will just say, I'm glad this slide is up here. I think my concerns, I'm glad to see some of our indicators doing better than we had anticipated the last time you were all here. And I do think that, and Ms. Feldman, not to put you on the spot, but I think when you were here for budget and we had the conversations around thinking about income tax and where we were, I recall this body talking about, this committee talking about the fact that we would not necessarily see the impact of federal layoffs until later in the fall, winter, and what kind of hit we were going to actually have. That we have for you all, you have the indicators you have in front of you to look at. And we are living in very, very uncertain times. And to truly understand the impact of the federal employees who have been laid off or fired but receiving paychecks through the end of this year, we wouldn't have a real handle on that until probably the end of this year over the winter. Is that still accurate?
Nancy Feldman, Department of Finance. Yes, last week we released the Revenue Estimating Group report, and we reiterated that there's no indication, both from a revenue perspective as well as an economic indicators perspective, that despite the very real activity that's occurring with people losing their jobs, among other things, that none of our factors that we look at have yet to show any of the concerns that we all have based on all the information we have at this point. So for September 30th, I guess there's two things happening as of today. One is those employees, federal employees who accepted a deferred layoff, if you will, go through the end of September. And as of today, we might have a federal shutdown on or about October 1st, which has implications that we all are aware of, both for federal employees and for contract employees. So our expectation is we might have some better information in November at the earliest.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Feldman. And I think, and people may not have seen this, but late last night, the president also told federal agencies to prepare for another round of mass firings. And so we are yet potentially going to see, and we all know from all the work that the comptroller's office has done and all the other estimates that Maryland, and particularly Montgomery and Prince George's counties, are the hardest hit when it comes to these. And you mentioned the potential shutdown of our federal government. So I think, I'm glad we have some good news. I will also mention, and it's in the packet, and I appreciate this, that our GEO bonds are not the only source of funding for our CIP. They have long-term impacts because they're 20 years commitment to debt. And so I think it's also important, as people are hearing us, and what I think this council has done a very good job of over the last few years, when we've had additional revenue, as we're seeing now in projections, is to put that towards PAYGO to be able to fund some of our CIP projects. So I again want to reiterate some of the things that we've done in the past when we haven't changed our spending affordability guidelines, but there are ways that we can look at meeting some of the need in our community. I will turn it over to my colleagues now. Councilmember Cass, do you have anything? Yeah.
I guess this is one you can't tell. If it lights up. But thank you, Madam President. And I agree with what you're saying. And I don't have any questions, but I do, as part of the history of this, when I first became a member of this Government Operations Committee, which is 11 years ago, I guess now, when I ran, it was always mentioned that if debt service was a department, I think it would have been the fourth largest department in Montgomery County. It might have been third, but I think it was fourth. Was it third? You're saying third? Some people have different memories, but it could be third. I agree with that. But anyhow, it was scary. And I came from a municipality that didn't have debt, and it was just scary. And the Government Operations Committee, over time, has said we're going to reduce our debt, and we did. And you always use the quote that my mother used to say, medicine is a wonderful thing, but if you take it all at once, it can kill you. And so we did it in a proper dosage, and I think we have done it in a proper dosage. And to your point, Madam President, we are in the most volatile times that you could possibly be in every possible way, whether it be economic, whether it be any other feature for what America's going through. And the fact that in the packet it says we could, if we needed to, revisit this in January or February or whatever that time frame would be, I believe that the staff's suggestion of option A, is the best. If others wanted to discuss option B, I'm certainly willing to listen. But option C, as far as I'm concerned, right now, should not be discussed, especially because of what you just said about more people having the great possibility of losing their jobs. And Montgomery County would probably be the most affected by anybody on that. So I'm in favor of option A.
Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. First of all, I appreciate how you started. I have seen multiple times in multiple fiscal policy dynamics where it has become a trend where policy change recommendations come as there is an outcome that the county executive is looking to achieve. And that is fiscally irresponsible. And I don't think it's an appropriate way to govern. And so I appreciate that there are rationales behind each individual decision, but the idea that we would change a fiscal policy midstream, particularly as we face the headwinds that we face, as noted by the council president and chair, in order to get to the place that the county executive would like to go. We went through this with OPEB. We have gone through this in other instances. It is just not a fiscally responsible or sober and serious way to move forward with our fiscal policies, and I think it sends the wrong message to the public of our fiscal stewardship after such significant efforts have been undertaken, not just by the three of us and not just by this current council, but by the prior councils. I think it would be an affront to the work and the decisions and the tough choices that they made in the past. The previous chair, Councilmember Navarro, County Executive Ike Leggett, and others. There were very difficult decisions that have put us in the position because we set fiscal policies, because we followed those fiscal policies, even when they were challenging. We are now in a better position. And the other reason why we're in a better position than we were is, one, some of the downside risk in our regional economy haven't hit us yet, as we heard earlier, and that is a challenge, and we need to be prepared for that and make fiscal policies and carry out our fiscal policies to reflect that. But it's also because we've dramatically increased the operating budget. And so the idea that we would use the dramatic increase of the operating budget, which has included tax increases, and then use that as justification to prove that we should also dramatically increase our debt is a downward spiral for fiscal irresponsibility. And it sends not only a bad message to the public, it sends, I think, a really unfortunate and challenging message to the rating agencies that we rely on in order to be able to borrow money to build schools and to build recreation centers and to build fire stations and police stations. I just don't think it's an appropriate path for us to move forward. I do think that taking a look at the indicators are reasonable. I think taking a look at how we calculate makes sense to me. Whether or not we include certain factors in is fine. But to do that as justification, not for sober analysis, is just not a reasonable way to govern, and it has become the trend and not the exception from this current administration, which is very troubling to me. My perspective is I think there could be a justification to look at a modest increase. Any increase that goes beyond 7%, from my perspective, seems inappropriate based on, the plethora of data. We can round up to a whole number. I think that's fine. That's essentially what the council staff has provided. I think that seems reasonable to me with option B. I think it's a modest increase. It does reflect the fact that the indicators are up. It does put us in a position to be able to reassess. But I think going anywhere close to what the county executive has proposed and using a change in the way that we calculate it in order to justify it is not only inappropriate, I think it's fiscally irresponsible, and I think it would send a really troubling sign to to the markets, to the rating agencies, and to the public. So my view is I would be comfortable with option A. I think that's certainly the most sober choice. I think there is a reasonable argument for option B, particularly because if you look at the revenue increase, it's just over 7%. If you look at the property tax projections, it ranges from 4 to 7%, and so over time, that 7% seems to be within the range of where we are. I think we can very firmly, based on our current policies, based on the current indicators, make that argument, and I think you, Council President, you, GO Chair, the next Council President can very comfortably go to the rating agencies and very clearly explain we didn't change our policy to get to an outcome that we wanted, which I think would put us in the position that the state of Maryland is currently in, and that I'm very concerned about, and I know is shared by colleagues on this committee, versus here is what we based it on, based on our existing policy, based on the factors. This allows us the flexibility to address, what is the challenges that are coming down the pike. I think that, would be where I was. So perfectly comfortable if the will of the body is to go with where Councilmember Katz was at option A. I think that's the soberest of decisions. But I think, there is a reasonable argument to be made for option B based on the factors and based on our existing policy, and so I could comfortably move forward with option B, noting that if things are worse as we head into January, that we could address that and we could reflect that as we move forward. So with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for both of you moving on to the different options. Can we go back to the slide that shows the different options and the table? Because we do have our Director of Parks here. And I do want to just highlight that option B, which I would be actually comfortable with at this point as well, given for all the reasons Councilmember Friedson articulated. And there's a difference, though, I just want to highlight of what the staff is recommending regarding option B and for parks, just to highlight that at a moment. And I know if the Director of Parks wanted to speak to this at all.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to address you. It's Mitty Figueredo, Parks Director. We understand that the big issue here is the decision that committee is making about general obligation bonds. I just want to emphasize that for us, we believe that the park bond discussion should be decoupled from the county's general obligation bonds. Our park bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the commission. They don't affect the county's borrowing capacity. There is, of course, a link, and that's through our operating budget, which is where our debt service hits. And we always try to be very transparent about our major known commitments. The amount we're talking about here, going from $8 to $9 million, is pretty, de minimis compared with the amount of general obligation bonds you all are considering. And we've been at $8 million for 8 years. Our fiscal analysis shows that the additional $1 million a year, it has a big impact for us, but I know that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about what we can do with it. We're talking about whether we can, whether we can absorb it. It hits our operating budget to the tune of about $80,000 a year. And we know that we are very constrained. This is the environment we're in. We're doing everything we can to cut our costs and be reasonable in all of our requests. And We'll be, back here later to talk about that, but we believe that about $80,000 a year is absorbable for us. So that's our ask, that the council separate the two discussions and consider, giving us the capacity to borrow another $1 million a year over the next 6 years so that we can.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate
Thank you very
that.
much.
So, all right, so our decision point, unless anyone has any other further clarifying questions, is what do we recommend to the full council? I'm also comfortable going with option B at this point at full council, knowing that we are able to revisit this when we have more information. And so, I don't, Councilmember Katz,
I can certainly live with that. It's not my preferred option, but I do believe it's something that should be discussed. I would do it the opposite of what we're doing. It's saying that we could revisit this in January rather than, with the higher, I would do it that we should go lower and then visit it with the higher in January. But I can live with option B.
all right.
And the decoupling, or
And the decoupling, right.
whatever that term was, please.
Right. So it would be option B is a 7% increase across all years for our GO bonds for the county government, and a 12.5%, or to put that in better context, $1 million over across all the years for our parks and planning bonds. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I'll just note the county executive's original recommendation, if I am not
yes.
mistaken, was 21% increase in the GO bonds and a little less than a 4% increase for park and planning bonds. If we're being consistent here in the sense that if you look at the 7%, it would take you to basically a little over 8.5, and so we're rounding up to the nearest whole number.
Yeah.
And we're doing the same. Actually, at 7%, it's a little under 20 million, and we're rounding up to the nearest whole number to get us to 300 million. So we're getting, because the number is so small, the percentage changes on the roundup, but we're actually rounding up similarly here to whole numbers, which I think is reasonable. So thanks.
Great. All right. So I think that is unanimous for the committee to recommend to full council. And I appreciate the staff providing us with option B, and very much appreciate all the work of the staff at OMB and Finance, and for being with us today. And thank you for our Parks Director for joining us as well. And with that, that is our last item for this committee session. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.